Today, every day seems to bring news of changes to life that the present epidemic is bringing, affecting everyone in some way. One might draw a parallel with the changes and uncertainty in Britain and Ireland that followed the events of the Civil War and Commonwealth period. Life for many became something of a lockdown, with people managing at home as best they could to weather the crisis that was religious, constitutional, and social. 7 long years of conflict and upheaval were followed by wars in Ireland and suppression in Scotland and military rule. Indeed, in Scotland it's called the War of the Three Kingdoms, as work for musicians became much harder, and many that had lost posts in the court, theatre or church, so they sought patrons and employment in the domestic sphere or left the country altogether. One such musician, who we know quite a lot about, is the singer and lutenist John Wilson, whose long life and several careers brought him considerable fame in his own time. This talk considers Wilson's time in Oxford during the period 1642 to 1661, after which he returned to London. It also considers his output during those years, his Salterian Carolinum, his cheerful airs or ballads, and particularly the Bodleian b.1 manuscript. By 1642, London had become too dangerous a place for Charles, and he and his wife and much of the court took up residence in royalist Oxford. He at Christ Church, the Queen at Merton. Periods of calm were punctuated by bursts of serious fighting near and around the city, with sieges starting in each May of 1644, 45 and 46. By summer 1646, the King's garrison in Oxford had become untenable, and on the 25th of June, the keys of the city were formally handed over to Fairfax, the leader of the parliamentary forces, with the larger part of the regular Oxford garrison having left the day before. He sent in 3 regiments of foot soldiers to maintain order. From then on, Oxford was in parliamentary hands, and the city and university were occupied by troops, and big changes to university life ensued, none more so than for the musicians of the city. The upheaval of the social order and of university life in Oxford after 1646 included the destruction or removal of the organs and the end of choral services. Magdalen's organ was famously carted off to Cromwell's own house in London. The 4 colleges with choral foundations had their services discontinued, and other colleges that had employed musicians, but without surviving foundations, stopped employing musicians for their chapels. The singers and organists of Magdalen, New College and Christ Church were no longer paid, though their names were not removed from college registers. St John's College Choral Foundation is interesting, as it had only recently been refounded under Archbishop Laud in 1637. But it too was discontinued after 1648 and the men and boys discharged. The St John's organist, William Ellis, lived out the period with weekly musical meetings at his house. After 1646, the musicians of the town were basically left to fend for themselves in teaching and doing what they could. The few court musicians that had come with the King and Queen to Oxford were also without jobs or incomes. Wilson lived through Oxford's upheaval in the 1640s, but had had 3 careers already by that time. Born in Faversham in 1595, he worked his way into the city and the theatre and was composing for masques by 1614, as a song from the Masque of Flowers of that year survives by Wilson. As a boy, he's likely to have been the John Wilson who, in February 1608, was apprenticed for 8 years to the actor John Hemmings, a freeman of the Grocers' Company. Ian Spink is pretty emphatic that the Jack, spelt with an E, Wilson, mentioned on page 107 of the 1623 Shakespeare Folio edition of Much Ado is our John Wilson, and certainly by around 1615 Wilson was with the Kingsmen Company, where he would have worked alongside Robert Johnson, taking over from him as composer and musician for the troupe around 1617. In particular, Wilson provided music for a string of plays by John Fletcher, though it's the few songs with words by Shakespeare that Wilson is probably known. Wilson was admitted also as a city wait in 1622 on recommendation of the then Lord Mayor, and was hopeful of getting royal attention. Stories of how he did this are related by Wood, but it would seem a royal appointment was late in coming, as there were no posts available until 1635, when he at last became a member of the Lutes and Voices with a salary of £20 per year and livery. He had noticeably sung in Shirley's Triumph of Peace in 1634 as one of the city waits that took part, and is mentioned and listed by Bulstrode Whitlock's detailed accounts of the masque as a countertenor. Wilson was one of the group of musicians who had accompanied Charles to Oxford. He had stayed as he gained his doctorate in 1644, which occasioned the portrait that is now part of the musical faculty collection. According to the antiquarian and historian Anthony Wood, who left detailed accounts of the people and events in the city during the interregnum, Wilson found a patron after 1646 in Sir William Sarsden of Churchill, some 30 miles northwest of Oxford. Little of the old Sarsden house of William remains today, other than the chapel, but Wilson may not have stayed long at Churchill, as Sir William had a house in London, and Wilson clearly kept his Oxford and London connections going. The next we know of Wilson is around 1656, when at 60 he was offered the Heather Professorship of Oxford University. According to Wood, I quote, "Upon the desire of Mr. Thomas Barlow of Queen's College, made to his quondam, i.e. former, pupil, Dr. John Owen, Vice-Chancellor of the University, he was constituted music professor thereof, which, with other help from some royalists in these parts, he then having a lodging in Balliol College, found a comfortable subsistence." To get his appointment, Wilson would have had to have built up connections with Oxford musicians in the 1640s. Two in particular are important. William Ellis, who, as we have heard, had been the organist at St John's until 1646. He was important as an Oxford copyist of keyboard and part music. Without an income from his organist job, he held public music meetings in his house, already mentioned, which seemed to have served as an alehouse on Broad Street, and it seems that for a while Wilson presided at the meetings. The other musician who clearly worked closely with Wilson in the 1650s was Edward Lowe, the organist and choirmaster of Christ Church. Like Ellis, Lowe was a composer and copyist, and had also been relieved of his duties during the Commonwealth and returned to them after 1660. He deputised for Wilson as professor in the years just before 1660 and took over the post fully on Wilson's departure for London. Crucially, he's the main copyist of the B.1 manuscript. Anthony Wood gives us a detailed account of the B.1 manuscript, saying that it was given to the Bodleian Library on condition that it was not to be published until after his death. It was not then part of the music school collection. It also seems to have had dedicatory poems which are no longer there. Wood relates, "But above all things that our author Wilson hath published is highly valued by curious men. A manuscript of his framing, containing compositions, partly to be played on the lute, but chiefly on a treble or bass, set to several odes in the first book, and in others of Horace, etc. This book, which is in folio, bound in Russian leather, with silver clasps, he gave to the public library before his Majesty's restoration, but with this condition that no person should peruse it till after his death." No explanation for why this was to be so was given. There are two hands at work on the manuscript, which may have been compiled from different sections. Certainly the solo lute music at the start might have been a separate entity before the book was bound together. The two hands are those of Edward Lowe, who is the principal scribe, and Wilson himself, who corrected the words and music, but significantly added some of the solo lute music and all of the tablature accompaniments to the songs. Most probably, Wilson employed Lowe to put his songs together as a sort of magnum opus in the years when they were both in Oxford. Later, Wilson checked over the book and added the tablature accompaniments and completed the solo music cycle of preludes. Perhaps Wilson had funds to do this and was able to employ the impecunious Lowe during the lean years of the 1650s. At some point before 1660, it was presented to the Bodleian. There had been two Oxford professors of music before Wilson. William Heather had endowed the chair in 1622 with some instruments and music books to promote a weekly music practice. He included specific instructions for music practice on Thursday afternoons during term times, except Lent, and that there should be a master of music. This master was to look after the musical instruments and books given by Heather, and to undertake rehearsals and provide both a theoretical and practical training in music. The professor could be called upon to deliver an annual lecture on the scientific properties of music, but the practical duties could be undertaken by a master of music. That weekly music sessions took place is certain, and a body of music books was assembled for this purpose, housed on shelves in the music school of the Bodleian's Old School's quadrangle. Richard Nicholson of Magdalen was appointed first in 1628, followed by the second professor, Arthur Phillips, in 1639. Then, during the Civil War, with the collection falling to disrepair, Phillips departed, and there was a gap in the first 6 years of the 1650s, when there was no professor. It is significant that Wilson was not a university man, but a London court musician and an avowed royalist. There's no suggestion that he'd been a choral singer or connected with any university up to the 1640s, and was something of an outsider and perhaps an unusual choice. I'd like to consider now the wider political background to 1656. After several years of direct military rule, Cromwell facilitated the election of the Second Protectoral Parliament in 1656. Only those approved candidates in the election could take seats, and some 150 were barred, and the Royalists and Catholics could not vote or stand. This highly unrepresentative Parliament produced the humble petition and advice to the Lord Protector. This bill effectively offered Cromwell the crown. It was rejected by Cromwell in 1657, though he died in 1658. His son tried to continue the protectorship, but by 1658 the writing was on the wall for the Cromwellian regime. The Whigs of the old court party were frantically networking to facilitate the restoration. Part of their campaign was to build a personality cult around the executed Charles I, portraying him as Protestant martyr who had died for his religion and country. In Oxford, the appointment of an avowedly royalist ex-court musician in 1656, as the professor, showed some defiance by the university. Wilson, it seems, was close to the king and had received signs of royal favour. It was said that the king would put his hand on Wilson's shoulder as he had performed. During the years of the Second Protectorial Parliament, Wilson had been working on his settings of 27 psalms, based on the Icon Basilique, in a collaboration with the poet Thomas Stanley. He titled the set Psalterium Carolinum, the devotions of his sacred majesty in his solicitudes and sufferings. Rendered in verse, set to music for 3 voices and an organ, or theorbo, by John Wilson, Doctor and Music Professor of Oxford. Wilson had it reissued in 1660. The Psalms are domestic devotional music in the solemn style tradition of Henry and William Lawes's Choice Psalms and Walter Porter's Motets of 1657. The 3-voice and continuo Psalms by Wilson are rather conservative, even compared with Porter and Laws, and there is little in the way of imitation or direct musical representation of textual meaning. The icon is a purported spiritual autobiography by King Charles and was published only 10 days after the king was executed. It became extremely popular and was fully utilised as propaganda by the royalist propaganda machine. That Wilson and Stanley should have produced their version in psalm form was clearly provocative, but the fact that they were not pursued for it suggests the weakening hold of the parliamentary faction by 1657. Wilson had never matriculated at the university and was not formally admitted to any college, but was certainly housed and fed by Balliol College, and his name appears a number of times in the Buttery books for the food that he had paid for at the college up to 1660. We know that Balliol was certainly something of a hotbed of royalism and was conveniently placed in Broad Street, close to Ellis's house and close to the Bodleian. Wilson is known for presiding at William Ellis's He of St John's gatherings, the most important of the 4 weekly musical clubs in Oxford at the time. Ellis appears first on the list of music masters who were now in Oxford and frequented the said meetings, supplied by Wood, who personally attended. Second on the list is Dr. John Wilson, the public professor, the best on the lute in all England. Wood states that he sometimes played on the lute, but most presided the consort, that Wilson was the most curious judge of music that there ever was, and that he was a pretender to buffoonery. An example of this is when, on hearing with amazement the virtuoso violinist Thomas Baltzer at one of Ellis's meetings, I quote, "He came to one of the weekly meetings at Mr. Ellis's house, and he played to the wonder of all the auditory, and exercising his fingers and instrument several ways to the utmost of his powers. Wilson thereupon, the public professor, the greatest judge of music there ever was, did, after his humoursome way, stoop down to Baltzer's feet, to see whether he had a hoof on, that is to say, whether he was a devil or not, because he had acted beyond the parts of man." Now, Wood is quite explicit on the location of Ellis's meetings. He says they were situate and being in a house opposite to that place whereon the theatre was built. From leases found for Broad Street, Bruce Bellingham, in his 1982 article, places this as the tenements on the west side of Broad Street, numbers 46-47, on a site now occupied by the new Bodleian, but in a building that survived until 1934. A number of verses, such as those by Southwell, the amateur poet, and Birkhead, on Wilson's playing survive at these meetings, and are testament to his acknowledged skill at the time. Ellis's meetings went on throughout the Commonwealth and continued to about 1669. Margaret Crum, by the way, the aunt of the present president of the Gamma Society, in her work on the music school collection, detailed that Wilson directed the revival of the music collection. During the Civil War, the music school had been used as a magazine for soldiers' apparel and coats, and was in a sorry state of repair. Wood has it that Wilson supervised the repairs resulting from the war to the School of Music and the music instrument collection. For instance, a bill dated March 1656-7 is for mending 4 viols and for 6 bows made for school viols. Several bills for January to October 56-7 in his hand testify to his endeavours in restoring the school to full use, especially in improvements to the building. The music school itself was removed from the upper floor and rehoused on the ground floor. Instruments were bought and repaired, and new sets of books were copied. Wilson's reputation had certainly benefited from the number of Playford printed songbooks that contained his songs starting in 1652. Yet by 1656 he was over 60 years old and clearly wanted to prepare his songs for posterity himself, and this in part must have been the impulse for his Bodleian manuscript. The same desire for posthumous recognition may have also led to his last major project and his last attempted foray into print. His cheerful airs or ballads is an attractive work and has always been known and consulted. It was mined in the 18th and 19th century for glee material, was known to Chapel and all who followed who were interested in old English song. It aims to preserve the repertoire of its time, both as a continuo song for voice and lute, or as three-voice part song, or a combination of the two. The vocal bass part deviates little from the unfigured bass part supplied with the cantus primus part in the Book 1. The secundus and bassus vocal part books, Book 2 and 3, were printed as separate books. Of the 87 songs, most are by Wilson, but there is a sprinkling of songs by Johnson and Lanier. Wilson states in his preface that it was printed by W. Hall for Richard Davis and, I quote, being the first essay, for all we understand, of printing music that ever was in Oxford, and the printers being unacquainted with such work, hath occasioned the faults hereafter mentioned. He then gives a long list of errata. Wilson is right. His Cheerful Airs was the first printed music book from Oxford. There are many concordant songs between the B1 manuscript and Cheerful Airs, though the keys are sometimes changed and the addition of a second voice brings a different character to many of the songs. The two upper parts overlap a lot and can sound better with the cantus, which always has the tune, an octave higher than the secundus, rather than as equal voices. One reason Wood gives for the decline of the meetings after 1660 was that some returned to their college appointments, like Alice and Lowe, or like Wilson left Oxford for good. Wilson regained his place at court in 1661 among the lutes and voices, and continued to serve to his death on the 22nd of February 1673/4. He was also admitted as a gentleman of the Chapel Royal on the 22nd of October 1662 in the place of Henry Laws, his friend. As always, he is listed as a countertenor singer. Wilson remarried late in 1670. It is a measure of the high esteem that he was held that he has a memorial slab in the east walk of the little cloister at Westminster Abbey. You can see it today. The manuscript is made up of 16 quires of French paper with 2 different watermarks. The first quire constitutes the solo tablature music, and it may have existed outside the rest of the contents before the book was put together. There then follows 226 songs. In general, the songs go from the more well-known and popular to the more complicated and arcane. All the songs that are also found in Cheerful Airs are found early on in the manuscript. The first song with tablature does not occur until folio 139. It's clear that the tablature was added after the songs were put in, though in all cases a third 6-line tablature stave is ruled under 2 lines for the vocal part and bass line. The sense is that it was a long-term project, and the process of adding tablature to all the songs was intended, but was only part finished. There are exercises at the front. The manuscript opens with a series of exercises on each chromatic pitch of the scale, starting with F and ending with E. Above each bass note there are 2 or 3 tablature letters, making 3 or 4 part chords that explore many of the chord shapes and their chromatic alterations. In part, this is a technical exercise, as in most cases, between each position at least one note is chromatically changed. It may also be to identify the chord configurations and provide a palette of hand positions to choose from. It's clear that hand A, that's Taylor's hand, contributed first to the cycle of 30 solo pieces, and that hand B, Wilson's hand, added his contribution later. Wilson numbers the pieces up to 21, but else does not do so. All the pieces have a cut C mensuration sign. There are 2 versions for the prelude in B flat. It's clear that hand B fills in the pages before and after A, and in some cases on the same page where space allows. Shakespeare died in 1616, and Wilson may have known him. He certainly knew Fletcher and probably many of the literary figures of the first part of the 17th century, as in his over 300 extant songs, he uses words by a good number of the Cavalier poets. And indeed, a number of the poets of the day named him in their verses. Perhaps the most obvious characteristic of the lute tablature parts for the songs is the infrequent use of the top string. This might suggest that he expected a re-entrant tuning and that the top string is down an octave. However, few songs ignore it altogether. This characteristic is shared by the solo lute pieces, and here in the whole cycle he only has recourse to using the top string 27 times, and in 11 pieces he does not use it at all, where he uses it in a downward scale passage. However, it's clear that to make musical sense the top string must be at pitch. Often Wilson uses high positions in the middle registers and the middle strings rather than the top string. Though it's clear Wilson has a 12-course lute, he fingers the courses with the left hand only down to the 7th course and not the 8th. Almost always the vocal line moves uninterruptedly. Where rests in the vocal line occur, they are to allow for breathing and are short. The bass line moves without interruption, and the lute tablature reflects this. The lute tablature normally contains the bass line. It may allow for octave displacement and pedal notes, but the bass is always present, and it closely follows the rhythm of the bass line, and a bowed bass is not needed. Bass notes are sometimes accented and played on their own on strong beats with the chords to follow. This is frequently seen on longer notes and at the start and finishes of pieces. The texture is often of parallel tenths and sixths, moving up and down in runs that fully utilize the bass. There are normally 3 notes in the chords, but sometimes there are full chords, especially in the final moments. Wilson does introduce unusual harmonic modulations and changes of direction. There are some non-chord notes, such as major sevenths, which are introduced without preparation. Above all, Wilson's approach is both contrapuntal and often unexpected. It is worked out. And it seems at odds with most other contemporary sources with tablature accompaniments. There were a good number of verses dedicated to Wilson printed during his life, enough to show that his reputation was high as a performer and that his music was well known, though regarded as somewhat curious. By the 18th century his reputation had dimmed, with Hawkins and Burney, who were highly critical of Wilson's skills. Yet in the 20th century, particularly around the 1950s to 80s, there was a spate of articles by Cutts, Duckles and Crum on Wilson that created some interest. In truth, however, only a handful of Wilson's songs are known today, chiefly those in Spink's Musica Britannica edition. And this is the end of my talk. Personally, I think that the cheerful airs are really very good pieces and can be played in all sorts of ways and are tuneful. And it's high time there was a proper edition of the cheerful airs. Thank you.